Hi everybody, this is John Spritzler from Boston, giving a few more words about egalitarianism in the ongoing series. As I've mentioned before, I'm the editor of the egalitarian revolutionary website called pdrboston.org. As I have said more times than I can remember, the principle of an egalitarian economy is from each according to reasonable ability, to each according to need or reasonable desire, with scarce things equitably rationed according to need. Well, in this little video I'd like to talk about the first part, from each according to reasonable ability. What does that mean? And in order to put this in a slightly larger context, we have to keep in mind that the word reasonable is defined in an egalitarian society by the local assembly of egalitarians. Who are the egalitarians? Well, as I've said before, most people are egalitarians even though they've never heard the word before. If a person thinks that there should be equality in the no rich and no poor sense, as I discussed in the video about what equality means in an egalitarian society, then that's the first principle of egalitarianism, and the second is mutual aid. The idea that people should help each other, as opposed to the capitalist idea that we're sort of put on this planet to compete against each other. So if a person thinks that the children of a janitor should have the same quality of life and standard of living as the children of anybody else, a doctor or Bill Gates or anybody else, they believe in equality in the egalitarian sense. And the way equality is made real is this principle of from each according to reasonable ability, to each according to need or reasonable desire, and so forth. Okay, so the egalitarians in a local community are all invited to participate as equals in the local assembly, and that local assembly is the sovereign body. There is no higher authority, no higher lawmaking body. That local assembly at which all the egalitarians in the local community are invited to participate as equals makes the laws that everyone has to obey in the local community, and there's no higher governmental authority than that. And that assembly is where ultimately the decision is made as to what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. So the phrase from each according to reasonable ability means from each according to what the local assembly of egalitarians in a local community thinks is reasonable. Now, what's reasonable depends on the specific circumstances. I'll tell you what I think is reasonable, and I think that 99.99% of egalitarians would agree with me on these basic ideas. I think that it's reasonable that children should not be expected to contribute work to the economy. I think it's reasonable that people above a certain reasonable retirement age should not be expected to work any longer. Now, people could disagree on what is reasonable for the retirement age to be. The egalitarian Gerard Winstanley in one of the major people in the diggers movement in 1640 England, a very egalitarian movement, even though they obviously didn't have advanced economic productivity in the 17th century. He wrote a lot about what he thought society should be like, and I seem to recall that he thought that the retirement age should be 40 years. And, you know, once people have made it past childhood diseases and stuff, they tended to live, you know, maybe not as long as we do now, but, you know, they didn't die at 40 just because the average lifespan was 40. If they made it past childhood, high mortality rates, they lived into their 50s and 60s and 70s. And he thought 40 would be a sensible retirement age. I don't know for sure. People might decide on 65 or 60 or 50 or 70 for all I know, but whatever people decide, I think above a certain retirement age, it's reasonable that people that the reasonable amount of work that's expected is zero. Also, people who are physically or mentally incapable of working, their reasonable contribution would be zero. I think people who are taking care of children, you know, essentially full-time, to me that would count as reasonable, contributing reasonably according to ability. People who are taking care of elder people, maybe they're elder parents or elder people, in some other context, that too would be considered contributing reasonably according to ability. I think that people who are in some kind of a school or apprentice program to acquire skills to you know, to use later in life, that being in such a school or apprentice program and so forth, that would count as contributing reasonably according to ability. People might even decide that going to school for something that had no obvious economic utility, to study medieval poetry or something, people could decide that at least for a certain number of years, if you're, you know, sincerely studying it, would count as a reasonable contribution according to ability, on the grounds that you know, people having knowledge of such things makes our world better. I suppose there could be some debate in a local assembly about, you know, what does and what doesn't count in that regard, but those are some of the thoughts that I have. Now, what needs to be pointed out is that local communities typically are in a mutual agreement with other local communities, perhaps thousands or millions of other local communities, by using the process of voluntary federation, which I'll talk about more elsewhere. Basically, local communities sending delegates who meet to work out proposals that the local communities agree to or not, as they wish. So in order to have what I call a sharing economy, which is an economy based on the principle of from each according to reasonable ability to each according to need or reasonable desire, to have a sharing economy that might consist of thousands or millions of local communities that might even be planetary in scope, it could only happen if there is a mutual agreement among these communities as to what the different local communities are going to contribute to the economy, and how they're going to, you know, provide it to other people in the sharing economy. And for people to have a mutual agreement to be in the same sharing economy with another local community, they would want to not feel like they were being ripped off. So in other words, if you're in a local community and you're producing widgets and gadgets, and you're in a sharing community with with local community X, and word gets out that in local community X, most of the people don't do anything. They just sit around all day watching television or playing video games or, drinking coffee or whatever, and they don't do any useful work. They don't produce any useful service. All they do is take for free, because they're in the sharing economy, you see. They take for free the products and services that the other local communities are providing. Well, you might not like that. You might feel that you're being taken advantage of. So local communities would tend to want to maintain, as I spoke about in an earlier video about reputation and profit, they would want to maintain a good reputation as a community that's contributing reasonably according to ability and only taking according to need or reasonable desire. And they risk being kicked out of the sharing economy if they get a reputation to the contrary. So when it comes time for the local assembly to decide what's reasonable and what's not reasonable in terms of, someone, either someone or a whole economic enterprise doing such and such and expecting to be considered a member in good standing of the sharing economy, well, the local community is going to have to, sort of keep in mind how their decisions in this regard are going to be perceived by other local communities that they are in a sharing economy with. A local assembly could, for instance, decide that people don't have to do anything, and no one has to do anything, and it'll be considered a reasonable, contributing reasonably according to ability. But if such an assembly did make that kind of a decision, well, they would have to know that they're courting being kicked out of the larger sharing economy that they're part of, and that would mean that the people in their community would no longer be able to take for free, according to need or reasonable desire, products and services that are made by perhaps millions of other local communities that they used to be able to avail themselves of until they got kicked out. So in an egalitarian society, people are forming mutual agreements with each other constantly. It's always, something that people have to take into consideration when they're making any decision about anything. And this is the way it should be. We're human beings. We're a social species. We make a good world for each other by cooperating, and cooperation requires mutual agreement. That's why we have an instinctual appreciation for the golden rule. Even the individuals who don't follow it, we have an instinctual appreciation for the importance of it, because it's the basis of cooperation, which is the basis for human survival. And I think we've evolved to have that appreciation for the golden rule, because we'd have been a dead-end species otherwise. And so this process of defining reasonableness is embedded in implementing the golden rule among potentially millions or billions of people. So I think I've given a little sense of what contributing reasonably according to ability means. I hope that you are finding yourself getting interested in what egalitarianism is, and we'll take a look at my book, No Rich and No Poor. which discusses egalitarianism in more depth. And as I have said before, the reason that we need to know what an egalitarian society looks like in terms of basic principles is so that we can know how good it is, and so we can know how practical it is, and so we can have, and I mean hundreds of millions of people in the United States and billions worldwide, a shared vision of what we want. Because until we know what we want, we're never going to be able to say what it is explicitly and build a movement that aims for it explicitly. And until we can do that, we'll never win it. We'll remain on the treadmill of defeat, where the ruling class will give us this or that Band-Aid reform and then take it away later, as has been happening for centuries. And we'll always be living under the domination of a handful of very dominating, oppressive people, like the billionaire class that controls American society today. So these issues that this series is about, looking in some depth at what an egalitarian society is and what it's like. It's important that we have a vision. No vision, no victory. So on that note, I'll say goodbye until the next video.